I'm very fortunate. I love what I do. I wanted it to be beautiful, but I wanted the threat to be there. My name is Suzy Lake, and I'm an American-Canadien artist living in Toronto. I've been called a photographer, I've been called a painter, but I do know that really it's the performance language and drawing language that really orchestrates my work. I was the first grandchild, and my grandfather was an amateur artist. He was a roofer and sheet metal worker, but spent all of his time drawing and painting. And being the first grandchild, I would always go to the basement with him, and we would draw each other. Now, he passed away when I was 7, so this is a memory where, you know, I'm really being formed, and it was something of so much pleasure that it was something that I always wanted to do. In the 1930s, he would go to the Detroit Art Institute and watch Diego Rivera paint the frescoes. So many years later, I did a performance in the middle of those frescoes, and it was so hard to not cry throughout the whole thing. But my own parents thought that artists were kind of parasites on society, and I was allowed really to do it more as a hobby. I performed the good girl behavior. And as I was able to leave home, I could start to express myself. And it was very difficult for my family because they thought that I had become someone else. But it was only because I would not be able to say what my mother could hear. She determined my outward behavior. I think that my saving grace was, even though I could not fight her back, that I knew I wasn't who she was trying to form. It was assumed that I would get married and I would have children. I would have more of an education than she would. My children would have even a better education. We would be more established, more conservative, and live well, you know, without the worries that she had going through the Depression. She was raising me to live her dream. The generation that I came out of, it was so clear what we were not, but we weren't quite sure of who we were. But the entire time I was growing up in a very conservative house, making work was the thing that I knew was mine, and nobody else could take it away in terms of conservative standards of being a good girl or social impositions on, you know, lifestyle or so on and so forth. That was the one thing that was always mine. I was tall and skinny and gangly and awkward. And when I did dance as a child, I was terrible. But as I became an adult, I started doing dance and mime. I started to understand my body as though I was looking at it. I think that was really very helpful to me in terms of understanding the experience of the body. I would do these little performances that were very post-minimalist performances, and then I'd want to see what that looked like. So I would take my picture doing these things, and I would look at the discrepancy between what I felt and what the picture showed, until that there was an empathy in the image, that the viewer could understand my experience, but on their own terms. I could see how power dynamics worked in social circumstances, psychological circumstances, and political circumstances. And so I thought that a puppet would be a perfect metaphor for the control in the hands of someone else. And it's always important for me that I'm the performer so that I understand what the experience is, so that when I edit, I have the correct image that's going to, express. The thing is, I wanted to use the puppet in a circumstance like that would be empowering in some way. So when I built the puppet stand, I had to build it big enough that I could be lifted off the ground and not have any way to protect myself. And at one point, I was so exhausted because I was getting abused against the wood at times, and I realized that my automatic reaction was still to fight. And I thought, that's the dignified empowerment that I was looking for. I knew that that was the directive in terms of choosing the photographs that I was going to print. As I've gotten older, I trust being discreet. So I don't need to do something as dramatic as the puppet. I can stand for an hour and not have it be about endurance. It can be about prevailing. The viewer may not literally recognize, but perceptually they will feel it. I would stand there for an hour and I'd go into alpha, and but I'd have to anchor myself to know that my feet would never move for an hour, and then I would click the shutter and I'd stand there for an hour, and when it was over, I couldn't bend, and it would hurt for about 5 minutes before I could even sit down. The body understanding of it isn't there in the statement. The body understanding is in the story. And again, that's why duration is so important to me in my work. I was very, very involved in social change, political change. It was very clear that the American dream was a construct, and being a young white woman, I didn't actually understand the reality of that at the beginning. I just felt that it was really important to be a part of that movement and be a part of that change, and not hold the status quo. It's hard to remember when I first came to hear about feminism. I must have been in high school, and it didn't quite mean much to me at that point because I was part of the 60s. Social change was happening, and I presumed that as a young woman, I could actually move into my life as an equal. I realized what feminism was when I left home and was living in the inner city of Detroit, and there was an inordinate inequality in terms of women's access to education, to even knowing about opportunities to move forward. And I began working with community groups that focused on helping women in very simple ways that were critically important for these women, such as after my classes in university, I would go to an apartment in public housing and just babysit for children so that the mother could go to the unemployment line. And then gradually I realized that I could help her learn how to read and fill out forms and dress for job interviews. And I just became much, much more involved in the community focused on helping women. And to me, that's feminism beyond what I may actually declare as feminist artwork. Women helping women is the most important part of feminism. I also gained a lot of access through civil rights activities and public marches and so on and so forth. So for me, I basically learned from the community, and it was then the community that opened up organizations that distributed where people need help. So for me, feminism was all tied up in social change, equality, civil rights. We called it a time of strange bedfellows when I recognized that I had to speak as a woman. I just thought that was being honest. And I did the slideshow called On Stage. And I photographed myself modeling on the street, in the studio, or so on and so forth. But I did it awkwardly enough so that it looked like a mimic of fashion magazines. And when I presented that as a slideshow, I chose the slideshow because at one point I worked in an advertising company for cars, and the men would sit in the boardroom looking at slides of beautiful women with very little clothes on, and they go, "Give me some flesh, baby," and I thought, I want to do this as a slideshow to refer to the good girl that we weren't. And I presumed that I was inverting that representation of women. So because I had studied mime, I used the white face, because in mime, that means zero. That means no personality. Everything is understood from the body. And in painting, of course, that's the tabula rasa. And so I added the photographs and into the slideshow, and it was still met with contempt. I'm in it as the artist's voice. So I'm representing someone and everyone. I was using myself, as a device, but they were seeing me as an object, and they could not get past that male gaze. So much of the work that I did afterwards, the portrait work, was part of that, trying to actually clarify a social construct of identity, not feminism within clenched teeth. Some of my work is aggressive, but not all of my work is aggressive. And even the quiet work, they realize after spending time with it, it's very aggressive because it goes very deep, to the point where they feel it from their own experience, and I've led them there. In the late 70s, I was part of the Art Nika and the protesting the Americans going into Central America and so on and so forth. And gradually, we were all suspicious about how the media was covering it and everything. And Nicaragua had actually achieved their revolution in 1979, and but following that, the thing is, the Americans were denying that they had the Contras down there, and fervently denying it. And because I was part of this organization that was sending supplies down, art supplies for the literacy campaign, medicine, books, and, we were collecting it and sending it down. And I was developing film from the underground. So it was an interesting exercise, because I would be given this film and I'd have to develop it and hang it up in my darkroom, but not look at the image. And then someone would come by and collect it. At one point, I thought, okay, a few of the other members of Art Nika were going to Nicaragua. I wanted to go too. My translator, in conversation, learned that I had gone through the Detroit riots, and I knew what a crossbow looked like and how to disassemble it. I mean, I've never used a crossbow, but I could talk to him about it and how it was the perfect sniper fire for the Contras in the north, for the Sandinistas to use. And he said, would you like to go to the north where the Contras are and photograph? And when we got up to the base up there, because it was all surrounded by Contras, they had to train me on how to use an AK-47. But it's a big freaking gun. And it's very, very heavy. So I had to learn how to use it lying on the ground. And it's hard to use. I don't know why, crazy people in North America use that as or want to have that as a weapon. But I laid on the ground and I pulled the trigger and it shot me back about 10 feet. Because my maiden name is Marks, and in Latin American countries, the maiden name is always used together with the American name. I was known as Suzy Marks Lake. And the leaders of the FSLN were at this celebration, and they all asked me to dance. And when Daniel Ortega asked me to dance, he was so handsome. My joke is that here I was, a political activist, returning to Canada with a crush on the president of a country. And I thought, oh my God. When I got home, I thought, how crazy was it for me to actually accept all these information or opportunities to go into these dangerous parts of the country when I've got a 2-year-old at home? I wanted to have a child. When I got pregnant, I was absolutely terrified that it was going to change my life. I was absolutely terrified that I wasn't going to be a good mother. But it's really interesting. Throughout my pregnancy, it's almost like God hit me over the head with a mother stick, so my psyche slightly changed. I was still making work. With my child, I could always make something work. The problem was that I was also the mother to my husband. My husband was more and more demanding and more abusive. And then when he demanded more time that I couldn't make art, I realized that he was asking me to give up who I am, and I could not do that. The only thing that you really have is what you believe in. When I was young, I had significant support from important male artists or male dealers. And some of them would say, I'm not really sure what you're doing, but I know that it's real. And I want to help you open up with what you're doing. So I was very lucky that way. And of course, audiences would respond back in that time period, oh, she must have slept with them or something like that. But when I moved from Montreal to Toronto, Toronto has a very patriarchal arc of an art community, and everyone is very competitive. So So it was quite a long time before I could find women that were supportive. My generation just still really only had the role model, the male role model. I found that, women artists, good women artists, women that, were feminist to some extent, were still, the idea of competition prevented them from having the attitude, you've got nothing to lose. And so therefore, there was a lesser opportunity to have a group that would be willing to bear themselves to each other, to get to a deeper core. I knew that things had changed for women coming after me, but that really was a reality that, brought me to tears. It was my personal friends, inside or outside of the art community, that really gave me support. Even if they put on their big men's pants and function as a man, they still have the same resistance. And yet, a feminist woman will actually understand that. So at points where you need collaboration, cooperation, and working together and sharing a sensibility, even if there's a difference of opinion and things like that, there's a willingness to kind of work things out and help each other. A feminist really understands the resistance. Well, my generation was raised with the stay-at-home mother and the man goes out to work. And when I entered the workplace, the secretary took the place of the wife at work. So when I entered the workplace as a professor, men behaved the same. I may have had the same position as they did, but they also left the committee responsibilities to the few women that were teaching because of gender. They had no idea that they were always leaving things for the women to clean up after them, and would be very offended if you addressed it. I taught for 40 years. And I enjoyed every minute of it, and education changed radically over that 40 years. But I wanted the students to have the opportunity to actually speak with permission of how far or how deeply they felt things. And so in this 14-week course, they came from wanting to be a photojournalist to, wanting to kind of undermine things, so they grew into it. There is such a myth of what an artist career really is. So as a young artist, when you get your first gallery, it's like, I've made it. And then, you keep making work and nothing really happens, but you're a part of a community. So then your first museum show, I've made it. And then nothing major really happens after that, I had a major retrospective at the Art Gallery of Ontario when I was 60. And at the opening, I was astounded at how big the audience was. And when I was introduced, I just cried, and the audience clapped. I couldn't believe how long they clapped. And I spoke, and as I was coming down, all the women kept saying, "I'm so glad it was you." Whether or not that it was my I made it moment, I realized that what I was saying had helped them. I was so satisfied, Because as I said earlier, the only thing that you really have is what you believe in. And it helped somebody. I certainly know my foibles. I know my celebrations, but I'm still learning. I think I'm always going to be a life learner.